we're going to start recording. Yep, there you go. Well, okay, cool. Thanks, folks, for being here. And I guess if you want to lurk, just leave your camera off. But if you want to participate in the conversation, it would probably help to have your camera on, just so I know when you want to speak. You can kind of like lurch forward with your finger raised or whatever.
I do want to participate, but I wasn't sure if this was even happening, so I'm still eating. So I'm going to turn my camera and mic off so you don't have to watch that, and then I'm going to come back.
Perfect. Sounds good. All right. Well, cool. So, Matt, I know you said that you didn't get to finish. How far did you get?
It was about halfway.
Okay. And Nick, have you finished this book? Yeah.
And then I tore right into Diaspora.
Oh, God.
So pumped on Egan's mind.
Yeah. All right. Well, okay. So where does, I have plenty that I could discuss about this book, but I would love to give people the opportunity to raise a particular area first, if you want, because there's so much he covers so much ground, so many different areas in this. So if anything in particular appeals to you as far as like a good place to kick it off, let me know.
Certainly the evolution of gender, right away kind of stands out. Even just his pronoun, super consistent use of the ver.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that I really appreciate about what this book gets right, or seems to get right about the future, is that it's far more plural. That it's people are making an effort to escape their categories in a lot of different ways through this book. It's not just through gender reassignment or the proliferation of new genders. The thought of crossing neurotypes with the voluntary autism, or the anarchic move of literally creating your own island and leaving the world of interstate conflict behind you. Like all of these are instances where people, and down to even more like subtler and more personal things, like Violet Masala's insistence on not allowing other people's attempts to narrativize the world trap her in some sort of responsibility to them and their models, their ideas of her. She refuses to be defined by other people in this way, and and ultimately to her peril, right? Because she refuses to accept refuses to believe in the credibility of meaningful threats on her safety, because she's like, you don't get to tell me what's true for me or not, and so it's through the whole book, the statelessness, and this conflict, which for what it's worth, I really appreciated about the recent Adam Curtis documentary, I Can't Get You Out of My Head, because it's about this tension in the modern world between the momentum and the incumbent power of these like old hierarchical structures, and the liberatory ethos and vector of the self-authoring modern ego, and so we want to resist, or we want to break free, but at the same time, like, you can't break free of gravity. There's a great like, I know that is like precisely what transhumanists are always talking about. Is like, you didn't think we could invent a plane, so now you're saying we can't transcend death. but like there's a lovely section in here somewhere where Andrew Wirth is considering the oh no, you don't get to, you're not the boss of me protests of a mystical renaissance and humble science. And he's like, yeah, but you all got to eat. Like none of us are getting around the first law of thermodynamics. Right. Like you can bitch about science as much as you want, but like there are things, ultimately not everything is a social construction, and so like that's really what I got out of this, is that there's a way in which he's undermining the rationalist or realist impulse, by showing the networked nature of our ontological bedrock. Like I think like the island of stateless is an analogy or a metaphor for the constructed nature of reality itself. That it's like in this anthro-cosmological paradigm, but that's that's ultimately all we have, sort of, is each other. And so it in a way, like a lot like Blade Runner 2049, this book is challenging the idea of the hero in a lot of ways too, like the loner hero. Anyway, so like that's all stuff I think about when I think about what they're saying about gender here. Is that it's it's just part of this larger tapestry where he's he really wants to dig in and challenge either naturalist or nurturist models of of these things, at the same time that he's like also couching it in, I think, a language that is sympathetic to the the hard science fiction uber nerd rationalist audience that like wants, like he has I don't know if you get to the point where he gets infected with a bioweapon and has this sort of materialist revelation that he's just a bunch of molecules, that he's like, that this is like what civilization is staring in the face the whole time, and like we're all actually afraid to like accept the fact that we're just chemistry. Which, shout out to Yesayer for their song "I Am Chemistry" off of Amen and Goodbye, and just like what a trippy piece. Anyway, so that's my riff on it. I'd love to hear some other folks dive in. We just started on the topic of gender, and I was just talking about how much I love how his treatment of gender is like part of this larger conversation about the ways that we can and cannot rebel against our biology or against physics. Oh, now she's gone. But anyway, I'll stop rapping there for a minute and let other people chime in.
What strikes me in what you just said was that the ending sort of surprise or conclusion is, even though we can't resist physics, we are also responsible for it. That our very existence is part of what, I don't even know quite the words to put it, but the symmetry of all infinite possibilities was broken by our own self-knowing, and then it's a collective knowing, not just the individual hero, as you said, that holds it and anchors all of reality. So we are responsible for the existence of physics, even as we're subject to it.
But not just us too, right? Like even the machines, it seems like the AI are also contracting. Spoiler alert, distress.
Oh God, right. That was a nice touch.
Yeah, that distress is sort of a pre-shock wave of us having this revelation, and that it's the AI that are assisting in this chimeric construction of this theory of everything are also suffering from distress. It's not just the human beings that are putting the theory together. It's us and the machines that are assisting us. So yeah.
Well, and it's super interesting because early on in the book, I very much thought that he was going to reach a place where the stress was collapse disorder from all of the mucking about in the genome and Earth biosystems that we were doing. And then, yeah, he reached so much further into, absolutely everything plays a part and needs to be able to be integrated, or else we're gonna struggle with it.
So, hi, I'm Doug. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
So, I guess one thing I was confused about is why the machine holding the toe, the theory of everything in it, why was that imperfect to cause distress? Like, I guess the premise was that like a machine can't hold that idea as well as a human can, but I guess I don't understand why that was the case.
Well, it seems like it wasn't that it was imperfect to hold it. It held it in a comprehensive way that was able to become that, I think the term used was Aleph, but that it was so out of line with biological and particularly evolution and particularly human consciousness, because it lacked that deep history, and that was the cause for distress. I mean, obviously the universe had been imagined, but not everything could connect with it. Reminds me of autism.
I'm not sure. Like, there are certainly places in this book where, like with anything, I think he's just remarkably prescient and seeing very deeply into the nature of things, and but at the same time, it's also the case that science fiction is full of these sort of broken telescope kind of prophets that they, like H.P. Lovecraft being both a racist and a hardcore materialist who like thought that his visions were, just like bullshit, basically, that, just like refused to give them any substance. And so, yeah, you can be drawing in. And I think that's part of, what he's getting at in this book, is that a lot of people had an intuition about what was coming, but each one of us has, priors, I guess you can talk like a Bayesian statistics kind of a sense. We have conditioning that skews the probabilities that we assign the things that we observe, and so we're all like getting it slightly wrong. And so like that was, for me, it was less about why would a machine get distress as why would any being actually function as a keystone. Like why, because like why, like in the years since this book, and I posted this in the Discord channel, a lot of the research on like the science of science has taken a distinctly pluralistic turn, and it's now kind of believed that everyone is operating under different heuristics about what constitutes a satisfying explanation, and therefore we're all participating in a kind of collective computation that aggregates our individual measurements and our, kind of averages out our individual errors at a time scale that we can't perceive, and therefore we don't even recognize our participation in this sort of like super intelligence that is like the human species as a whole, or beyond, in a kind of like post-human critical sense that would include our machines and our legal agreements and so on. But so it's like, why does any one of us get to be the focal point through which this network ontology that radically undermines our conceits about a loner hero, in a story that also radically undermines our conceits about a lone hero? Why, and it's just one of those things, right? Like maybe it's just like it is with Deep Space Nine, like stepping all the way up to the brink of having a gay main character, and then like not being able to like actually out that character, and during, like, maybe this just like, it was just like a characteristic of the mid 90s that was like, you're like almost there, but you just can't there's like all of these concerns about what does and doesn't make for a good story, and so like maybe we're stuck in a kind of a situation where we can't actually go the full measure because you still got to sell a book or like pitch it to publishers or something, or like you still got to convince you, like it's just stuck in the way that we tell narratives because it's easier to tell a story that way. I don't know.
It definitely felt like this. It definitely felt like this book was written with like the conceptual, like with the concepts in place first, and then the characters kind of designed to try to fit the concepts and try to tell the story that way. And I felt like there were certain times where it didn't quite. Sometimes there were moments where it's like, okay, he's trying to find a way to say this big theory moment, like, but is everyone pointing guns at each other in this moment? Is this really the time where everyone would start doing that? But that also I really liked that, because it also goes like, yeah, maybe in a future where we're less worried about scarcity and things, maybe everyone would be a lot more willing to discuss, broader concepts about reality and things. And maybe every person you meet on the street would tell you their whole story and their whole theory of looking at the world and stuff. If, I don't know, like in Stateless, at least it kind of makes sense that everyone who lives in Stateless has, personal stake and is very invested in those sorts of things. But there were still a few times for me where it felt kind of like, okay, I would kind of forget which character was speaking because I was more just focused on the concepts that the character was saying. And it was kind of like, this person is just a vehicle for this concept and nothing else. I don't know.
That's a broad critique of science fiction generally, I think, is that characters tend to trail the ideas. But at the same time, that's totally my experience of like going around in festival culture, going around in a less structured environment where everyone's needs are taken care of and you're just sort of allowed to pursue whatever bullshit conversations you want. And like it always drifts to cosmology for whatever reason, as my friends would say.
And that's a strength of speculative fiction in general, and a particular reason to engage in it is that it requires us to suspend disbelief in order to explore something else in greater detail. And that's important specifically to do, and also just to have the capacity and the capability for a variety of reasons, including dealing better with each other as neighbors. It's a really useful ability, so long as we can step back out of it and also reintegrate with reality as we understand it.
I wasn't critiquing the genre or anything. I was just saying, like, when it comes back to when you're talking about the constraints of, like, I want to tell this story, but in order to sell it, I still need to have an individual hero who gets to be the keystone at the end, kind of thing, because it has to still follow somewhat of what we'd expect from a narrative structure, even though the whole point, or not the whole point, but there was a lot of very collective ideas in there, but then it still ended up, like you said, being very individualistic at the end, or not individualistic, but at least putting all the focus on what is this character doing right now, kind of thing, because that's how we're used to.
I felt like it actually kind of wound up pointing the opposite direction. I felt like towards the end it had come around, it had taken the whole story using those motives to say, we are all our own keystone. It's there's maybe the first, which he says, but it's we're all an individual keystone, and like Michael was saying, it's how it kind of interrelates and integrates and converges and diverges, and how the differences are vectored.
I'll say that also. I think one of the threads that runs through this whole book, which is really important, is the question of intellectual property, and the fact that that Stateless is literally stolen IP, and they've built it. In a way, it's like he presaged Pirate Bay, except instead of Pirate Bay being a website, it's a physical location, which is like something that I've always, this book was written, I believe, before the term seasteading had even been coined, and there's
what is that term?
Say
I'm
what?
not familiar. What is that term?
Seasteading is like this ultra libertarian movement to just claim, floating. It's from as little as buying up a decommissioned oil rig to literally building your own artificial islands And this represents one of the many excellent sort of biotechnological versions of that in science fiction, where you grow a coral island and you make it into what Hakim Bey talks about as like the temporary autonomous zone. So this pirate utopia has always appeared at the intersection where people are denied access to an enclosed terrain, like an enclosed property, which it wasn't always intellectual property, right? It was like hunting on the king's land and that kind of thing. But IP, and then since then, speculative IP are defined as the second and third enclosure of the commons by Lewis Hyde in Common as Error, his history of intellectual property in Europe and America. And so I loved this because it's part of the question of the reduction of everything to code, right? Biotechnology is, in some sense, a gesture in the Silicon Valley religion, in the historical sweep of this whole thing, to what he's saying here, which is an information theoretic ontology, in which information, which he doesn't really bother to adequately define for the purposes of this story, but whatever, is underlies even physics. And so, this notion that when he's talking about having this, the revelation of him that he's a chemical robot, it's like all part of the what Richard Doyle wrote about in his wetware, or his three movements on the rhetorical transformations in the life sciences. He was writing about this totalizing information theory of the biological, and all that is like problematic with it. But so at any rate, what I actually wanted to say was that the whole thing about him being the keystone is interesting, because it does exist at this tension between who gets to take historical credit. And I think he resolves this very nicely with that synthesis that there was one person that it happened to be through, we can trace it back to that one person, but that doesn't actually mean anything, because ultimately that person is just the intersection of the interference pattern of all of these other historical forces, and they don't have any ownership of it. And so it's like the end of the book, after the stateless is sunk, it's like in so doing, stateless becomes like a kind of IP Christ that dies for everyone's sins, so that everyone can realize at the end of the book that no one actually should be getting credit for our ideas, because each of us is just a node in this network of information. So that's, yeah.
And so they all kind of conclude that IP, we don't need to hold on to the gene patents anymore. It's sort of vaguely suggested that basically everyone, it's sort of an awakening moment, the TOE permeating the minds of humanity, making clear our inseparability from the pre-space and each other, clarifies it all.
Right at that point, it seemed very much like a Nirvana kind of moment for everybody. At which point, yeah, you're not, it becomes ontologically absurd to try and argue for someone having intellectual property, kind of it just doesn't
or to some
work.
extent even just physical property. I'm gonna have to drive home. I have to leave work, so I'm just gonna be listening to this like a podcast, but I don't think I'm gonna be participating, because that would be dangerous. So, but
okay,
thank you.
But yeah, I mean, it does seem like all of the abundance stuff is resolved at the end of the book. No one has any need for anything, and the kids are all born awakened, and yeah, it's
maybe that's what it'll take to get over the IP like issue, like collective enlightenment. Otherwise, it's, I mean, as long as there's separate identities that can own things, we're going to keep accruing possessions in the name of those entities' alleged selves.
So, to that point of alleged selves, there was another thread through this book that I would like to get to, that I hope other people find interesting, which is about his journalism, and about the way that the like communication technology and AI function together in this future where he's got embedded recording technology in him, and that he goes through the life having to navigate a kind of what is in that society almost like a superhuman level of like a nuanced consent landscape, in terms of people know he's a journalist, and so he is dealt with differently than everyone else. It's not as intense as the so-called gargoyles in Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, where it's like the person is covered in recording gear and everyone knows that they're just recording everything, and so they're regarded with disgust and suspicion. But there is that kind of a thing that that he is a leak, and so people use him, and like the ethics around the instrumental use of cameras, both for like media and for the people who know that they can get on TV, the way that journalists are captured and exploited in wartime. That there was this whole thing that that I really, let me see, there was a couple notes I took on this. Let's see. One of which, okay, so one that's not about him as a journalist specifically, but that I thought spoke to issues of the way that media appropriates and sort of like colonizes us, no matter who we are. It's not he was talking about the anthropocosmologists and their distinction to remain invisible, to perpetrate this intense secrecy around their very existence. And so it was just this decision to not be represented by others at all felt very much like the concern of the indigenous, the wariness of Native Americans around photographers, and that there's, even though it's a by and large a like secular humanist rationalist kind of book, there were he found a way to bring in all of these concerns, not in like a spiritualist sense, but in like a political and sociological sense, about the the right to remain invisible, which, if you think about it in terms of the attack robot at the end of the book, that's like the Ingenuity's assassin bot, that this advanced military technology that is like, it's got like a predator cloak on it or whatever. And it is that question that I heard John Perry Barlow bring up in his talks years ago, which was about like how he doesn't mind being transparent to others as long as they're transparent to him. As long as, like, if his information is accessible under a government subpoena, then he wants to know who's subpoenaing his information. And again, that plays into this worldview that he's proposing in this book, which is that it is a cosmos that can be known. It's a cosmos that can be transparent to us. It's
I feel like this is getting so much into questions of and definitely it was a theme in the book. I felt like of control versus letting go of things to an extent so that we can actually live and share and collaborate and continue to exist and co-create with others. The more control we try to hold on to, the less life can actually come in. Like, so early in the book, he definitely, like, from a human kind of sociological aspect, he talked about this on the Kindle. It's page 45. I don't know how that parses for anything else, but when Gina and main character, I'm so bad with names, are walking, going out for the night and talking. And so she says, talking about like the extreme modifications of the U males. And she says, but why the face as well? It's not as if anyone would be likely to mistake him for anything but an N male without it. No, but being mistaken for an N male would be an insult because he's migrated out of that gender as surely as any asex. The whole point of being a U male is to distance yourself from the perceived weaknesses of contemporary natural males, to declare that their consensual identity, stop laughing, is so much less masculine than your own that you effectively belong to another sex entirely. To say no mere N male can speak on my behalf any more than a woman can. And then she just like is super frustrated. She's like, no woman can speak on behalf of all women as far as I'm concerned. But I don't feel obliged to have myself sculpted eufem or ifem to make that point. Well, exactly. I feel the same way. Whenever some John Iron Cretan writes a manifesto in the name of all men, I'd much rather tell him to his face that he's full of shit than yada, 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 yada. So, there's this one kind of dialogue of like, nobody can speak for anybody. But then there's this other dialogue of like, we don't exist except without each other. And we require, like, from tree roots and rocks to human identities, we require something to form each other ourselves against. But it is how we behave in that and how we respond that's gonna shape so much like what formation it takes place. And you go all the way into like, deep creation mythology and any mythologies, but definitely so clearly represented in the old Abrahamic stuff, and it's just case after case of God, of the all together of everything, making itself intentionally vulnerable to input from that which is less than the entirety on purpose, even though it doesn't need to. That's enough for me for a second.
I love it. Yeah. Can I just because we're reading excerpts, I think this is linked to another one that shows up later when he gets the wireless camera and puts it on the diver when the diver goes down under stateless in that initiation dive. And, so he says, Monroe, his guide that's volunteered to take him out to this, calls out from behind the crush, so much for authenticity. You realize you're changing the experience for everyone. And Worth answers, not for the diver. And he says, oh, right, that's all that matters. Capture the last glimpse of the real thing before destroying it forever. You ethno-vandal. Anyway, you're wrong. It changes things for the diver too. And it's, just this is so key because there's two things going on here that I recognize that I want to speak to. One is that my experience with Google Glass was that wearing a camera, and he talks about this later in the book, when he himself is wearing a camera after he's pulled out his recording system, and he's wearing a camera on his shoulder, and he talks about how naked he feels. And my experience with Glass was that you become it like induces a witness state, which I thought was funny. His recording equipment was called Witness. It it induces this state of looking over your own shoulder, and like you're aware as you're recording of the cant of your head in a way that you never are when you're not wearing a camera on your face, and you're aware that you are watching yourself from the future, kind of like you're watching this video later, and so so it does fuck with you.
It's interesting because I didn't appreciate my Google Glass enough to get, I think, to that point with it. But you're speaking to something that I had long since realized, like back from basically the advent of live journals. when all of a sudden every experience I was having, I was editorializing it into how I was going to write about it later. And realizing how much that has been like this past arc of experience for humanity, and how it's, you know, I mean, with anything that happens, you can talk about the downsides, you can talk about the upsides. I feel like it's most interesting to talk about them all, and, you know, like what has come out of it and what it's gotten in the way of. But it's definitely fascinating, this complete, and I think so. It's really, I'm going to tangent for a second here. Neurologists, there's another term that I'm looking for that's a little more specific, but for a handful of years have been talking about the new 11-dimensional structures in the brains of humans, particularly those Oregon Trail generation and younger, but hyper focused on the Oregon Trail generation, and not before and not after with the full digital natives. And the idea that this is highly related to our ability to abstract and synthesize and reapply. And that in the past, humanity has only had a handful of these every generation, your Da Vinci's, your Einsteins, your Teslas. And then now we just basically have a mass of humanity who can all do these things. And in part, it's because we grew up alongside our digital technologies. Not, you know, prior, you know, growing up prior to and then learning them, or growing up native to them, but not really, like we literally co-formed with our digital technologies, this group of people that they're talking about. And that's the end of my babble.
So I think that links into the other thing worth noting here, which is the accusation that by recording this rite of passage on Stateless, that he is that Worth is an ethno-vandal, and that, you know, simply by it's akin to the social critique brought up against something like Orientalism, you know, simply by admiring another culture as exotic to your own, that you are stealing it in some, you know, that you are commodifying it and you know, colonizing it, and that this is what everybody is worried is going to happen when the physicist behind the theory of everything observes and therefore kind of defines everything. That, you know, all of the various anthro-cosmological cults have different interpretations of you know, whether it's up to us to, you know, whether it's a race to the top of that particular mountain, you know, that like whether you can actually exert political power and kill your way to having some sort of ontological priority, or you know, other people are just see it as more of an issue of narrative power over other people. But it's this question that, you know, I think when I had Rolf Potts on the show, Rolf Potts, the travel writer, and we were talking about the way that social media has changed the travel world, that like literally, you know, now, as it used to be with like Lonely Planet and things like that, that like popularizing a lesser known travel destination would reshape it with tourist traffic. And, you know, so we, in the same way that like gentrification occurs in desirable neighborhoods, you know, that like you get these little like hotspots and they draw a lot of attention to themselves, and that transforms them in a way that forecloses on their continued ability to retain that kind of like biodiversity or whatever. And so, you know, it's interesting to, when I asked Rolf, because I think that in a way that I talked about with Eric Wargo when Eric Wargo was on the show, and, you know, Wargo talks about continuity of the self into the future as a way of the brain minimizing uncertainty. You know, even if you're addicted, that your addiction, your bad habits, your self-destructive habits are ways of sort of letting yourself know that you know how tomorrow is going to be. I'm going to be shooting up again tomorrow. That's, you know, and that's a way of colonizing your own future. So like, it's interesting how the folks that I have on the show, sometimes Rolf was one of them, Kevin Kelly in the next episode that I release with him is another. When I asked them, you know, to think about like what it is, what our responsibility to the future is. And when I asked Rolf about how, like, what kind of, what does it mean for him to consider the future as a present thing, and to think about his relationship with it. And he and Kevin were both kind of like, well, we hope that we hope that the future isn't dwelling on us. We don't expect it to. We expect the future to have its own problems. Like, Rolf said, like, how much do you really think about your great grandparents and like their struggles, and how much attention do you really give that? And Kelly said, it's our responsibility to make sure that they're not thinking about us in some sense, that we don't know, we're not planning for the future. We're not trying to solve their problems because we don't know what their problems are going to be. We hope that their problems are different than ours. Like Bjork has a line on her album Utopia about the same thing. Like we hope that we're not just giving you our baggage.
Well, and that aligns so much with so much of what we're learning in kind of the quantum realm. Like, deterministically, the implications of infinity are infinite. So it's not a matter of what and when, it's a matter of yes. And to some degree, that's where our own individual response, kind of really truly is ours and ours alone. Of course, everybody's co-shaping against everybody and everything's co-shaping against everything, but our experience that we direct as our own unique instant facet of this, infinity is also infinite in every direction. And, so yeah, the more that we dwell kind of beyond our reach, the more we're just going to be spreading ourselves thin and drawing ourselves into danger zones. But at the same time, we definitely need to, look to broad horizons and to ever broader horizons, because that's the direction that things go.
Something that's resonating for me here with what's been said recently was, one of the concerns from one of the AC groups was that having the wrong TOE would close down sort of the infinite possibilities. That if it came out, it's just this universe, then even in the future we won't have the option of jumping to a different dimension. So they were in a way that, well, we got to kill some people now so that the whole cosmos has access to a different future, which is quite a thought. I don't know how well it bears out. Right? It's up to me. I better, if I don't kill this one dude, or lady, sorry.
He definitely has the conservation of ignorance or something, where it's like, we're talking about a radically post-religious world in some respect, but everyone is still falling into these zealotries, and he even feels it in himself. Like, he feels the tug of the simple narrative, which is, incidentally, I just watched Godzilla versus Kong 2 nights ago, and I was just so delighted to see them poke at the, to sort of weaponize in a good-humored and ironic way the appeal of all embracing conspiracy theories and conspiracy narratives in that film, and just like, letting it be. It didn't have at all the kind of nuance of Greg Egan's treatment in Distress, but he made it. Godzilla versus Kong really acknowledges just how sexy it is to find a story that explains everything, and like gave that to viewers, just like, here, enjoy. Like, we're gonna make it preposterous. We're gonna make it like obviously bullshit, but at the same time, like,
Well, and it's so funny that we so steadily seek that, even at various steps of recognizing that it's counterproductive, and that if we could actually wrap our minds around everything, then nothing could exist, kind of idea. Like, I feel like to some degree, like, that is true, and we do have some recollection of that. Yet, it's these two opposite directions of striving, just like individuality and unity. And I feel like so much of where humanity has been in the like fragmenting and disassociation for so long, where we don't we don't understand that these things can pull together instead of pull apart.
Or like it's the the principle of enantiodromia, where in striving for one thing you get the other. Like in striving for a universe of maximum choice, you're willing to curtail the freedom and even the life of other people. That notion that every ideology is actually a kind of like a psychic parasite or invasion. It's like that it's driving you. It's not actually. So there's like that, incidentally, that again, he's at that tension between emancipation and control. He's trying to get information from the hackers about the location of, was it Sarah, the journalist who he had booted off this assignment, and he's talking to a sort of AI avatar interface, and the sign off that the interface gives is, remember, petitioner, data wants to be free, which is a callback to Cory Doctorow and information wants, Cory Doctorow has this, information doesn't want to be free, which is the riff on the cybercultural rhetoric that information wants to be free, and yet, of course, like this is being uttered by this like greedy demon that refuses to give him any information unless he's paying through the nose for it. And well,
and I feel almost like it's at that point, it's the information reaching out and saying that kind of through the medium of whatever he comes into contact with. And I feel like also it's almost to the point of like, really, information is free. And that's part of why we struggle so much, is because we build up all these barriers to information being free, and the tide of information just beats relentlessly at it from every angle.
Oh, but then again, like there's a metabolic cost, right?
Yes.
To everything, no matter. So it's like the metabolic cost of information wanting to be free is like friction. It's like turbulence, as blood moving through the arterial network or whatever. And so this I felt like this whole book was just about because when they're talking about like mixing with information, and like the implication is that distress is the psychopathology caused by the turbulence of physics mixing with information, and that the only way that it minimizes turbulence, the network of this world coming into being with itself, the way that it minimizes that turbulence is through dissipating the Aleph event through an entire network, the way that your body's circulatory system minimizes turbulence by the fractal branching pattern of your veins and arteries. That's okay. Now I clearly I belong in the hospital.
Well, no, because speaking of hospitals, exactly what you're talking about is the way that I largely view what's happening with this whole COVID phenomenon. Viruses are absolutely fundamental to our cellular replication processes. They're the ones that do all of the epigenetic switching when we go through environmental changes, both internal and external. It's part of why you have such symptomatics of cold and flu, particularly at seasonal changes, or when you travel and things like that. And so what's happening is that when there's a lot of, and there's been a couple of fairly esteemed virologists in the last year who have put out articles talking about how off-base the conventional understanding of viruses is, and how that's getting so much in our way. But so much of what's happening is that huge code rewrites, information are coming through, and they get queued. And so instead of letting each generation of cells mature before it moves on to the next level, the next stage of regeneration, it pushes the edits as soon as it can. So you get these buildups of layers of immature tissues that contribute to so many of the symptomatics that we see. But yeah, when we have systems as disordered as the modern humans' body systems are disordered, and big edits come through, I mean, like viruses are one of the mediators in the genetic level conversation that's happening ecosystem wide. And, you know, and it's hard because everybody's looking for like one clear explanation of what's going on. And like that doesn't exist. And that's why everybody's a little bit off base, even though every perspective has some portion of the right picture, I think.
Yeah. So to that point, if I can, I'd like to steer this in a slightly different direction from where we've been most of the time, although I think it kind of all relates, which is that this is one of the books, and it mentions it just in passing, but this is one of the books where we see a premonition, a like time loop style premonition of a global pandemic that escapes from a biological research facility. And it's on the beginning of chapter 19 where he's talking about the Mexico City cholera biotype, first seen in the aftermath of the quake of 2015, long since distributed globally. Nevertheless, millions of people survive it every year. And this is where he gets into the innovation of rapid response, bespoke antimicrobial medications that are like genetically tailored to, you know, the plague du jour,
right?
You know, where it's like we're at this problem now where we're facing now as a society the dropped directly into the middle of this epistemic conflict, like he talks about in the book, about what it is to be healthy or what it is to be human.
Yeah, that's a good one.
You know, what reality is. Also that dropped in the middle of this is a challenge to the approval process of vaccines, where it's like we are fast tracking this under an emergency use authorization. So there are other mRNA vaccines that are currently, like for Zika, that are currently going through the laborious years-long approval process, but nobody wants to wait on that for COVID-19, except a lot of people do, and they're the people that are, not going to take this vaccine. And so we have to kind of, it's fascinating in this book to see a world in which two things have in which two different sort of technological dinosaurs have completely escaped the electric fences. One of which is this, pharma printing, we're going to cook you up a new, completely novel vaccine within a few hours, kind of strongly decentralized access to biotechnology, even though it's within this restrictive IP framework.
As long as you're subscribed, right? If you have the funds to subscribe.
Right. And then the other is, which gets into the whole case in Austin with the plans for the 3D printed gun, and does that belong under First Amendment protections, et cetera. Is it free speech if it's, if like you can literally print that information? Does the body become speech under this completely now obviously obsolete legal framework in which the genetic code can be protected as intellectual property, like Monsanto has with so much of the human genome? Like, does that even make sense? And so like there's again this, the earthquake releasing Mexico City cholera biotype into the wild is the same as sort of like the storms on Jurassic Park, contributing to the chaos that unfolds on that island. It's an acknowledgement of the tension that Egan clearly feels as an author, that we have spoken to a few times on this, between the worldview he's proposing, which is the world that the world can be not understood by a single individual, but in some sense understood, and the way that people constantly misinterpret that, and he's constantly checking them throughout this book, saying that like that doesn't give anyone omniscience. That just because we can model these systems deterministically and we believe that they perform deterministically doesn't mean that we can predict them. And that's like basically, that's just, it's like elementary chaos theory, but it's just there's, when it's ironic, I think, in some sense, because it is such a good example of this instance where it looks like science fiction has predicted historical events. And again, if you talk to Eric Wargo, he's saying, well, that's because we live in a block universe, and it's not just deterministic and unpredictable. It's just unpredictable because we don't know how to contextualize retrograde information flow or something. Anyway.
Well, and that's so much of where her Masala's toe theory comes from, is contextualizing everything to a degree that everybody else took huge issue with, as even an approach. But that's how she got there.
And then of course, for distress to be happening, it like jokes on them because the future does already exist in some sense.
Right.
Like it must.
Right.
It must.
He kind of fudged that a little bit. Like, well, it could still turn out differently. Like it still depends on what we do now, which is the great dilemma. Like, does it matter what we do? Are we making choices? Yeah. The thing with the farm, that was an interesting vision of how he goes to stateless, and he's like realizing, like, oh shit, I got used to being like always healed. Like he cuts himself open, right? And then, well, just order up some paste, and you don't even have to go to the doctor for that. Now you can just have a dramatic suicide attempt and heal yourself with your in-home repair kit. And then, like, oh, on stateless, you might actually have consequences to your mortality without, but again, at the cost of like it's like, depending on Amazon Prime, it feels like I could have anything in the world as long as I'll submit myself to the sort of the alpha tech system that I live inside of. So he seems to basically, I mean, overall though, it seems like he's basically, at least in this telling, technology will take care of things for us. Like, we can argue about sort of who controls it, but basically more tech is going to be better, and seems to have solved global warming, at least for, some people. He suggests some people, become sort of stateless, will go to stateless because they don't have a place to go. But he's definitely like, yes, we will figure it out with enough technology, which,
I
there's
totally
obviously
see that,
a counter argument for.
I totally see that reading. And I largely felt like that's where he wound up as well. But I think overall, I feel like he came maybe to a place that I try to occupy of, we can get to a good place with technology, continuing to use technology at all, and going forward, we can get to a good place, and we can do it with technology as part. I think that, yeah, he winds up in some very different places that I don't agree with, but I feel like overall, the view of they're not opposed to each other, they're both integral, and we can achieve good outcome. It doesn't have to follow these fear-mongering, worrying lines.
Well, I mean, I think it's important to remember. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I just wanted to say, like, I've got a list of things I want to say, but I don't know. I've been in and out of the call, so I don't know what's already been discussed. And my points are probably pretty mundane compared to most of what you've been talking about. But the idea of stateless, because right after I read Distress, I read The Dispossessed, Ursula K. Le Guin's book.
Oh, yes.
So there's like a similar vibe between stateless and Anaris, but different. But it's just one of those things that almost reinforces that for me, as I get older, anarchy becomes more appealing in the stateless sense. Like people know that their survival is tenuous, and they all have to kind of pull their own weight and own their own shit to like make it all work. So there's like a common agreement there. And I think the interesting thing about Dispossessed was that also that common agreement kind of restricted individuality. So this is going on a different tangent, but I just thought that the whole concept of stateless was interesting, just from the sake of like, could that be something that we, like the Pacific garbage patch? Is that something that could be converted into, you know, a sea word, or what would you call it? Sea, what was the phrase? The sea island self-sustaining.
Oh, with seasteading.
Seasteading, thank you. Yeah. Something like someone could come up with a way to really just bind the garbage and eventually like introducing an organic biotech element like that would eventually like somewhat dissolve the plastic but keep it congealed together and then form like a big island. I thought that was something interesting. But there's a couple things like he brings up and then never goes back to, which it opens with the reanimation. Like that's the basis for Andrew's first story, but we never like revisit that concept. Like you'd think it was going to come back in the story later sometimes, but it doesn't. And I thought it was super interesting. The Ned Landers character, the super bioengineered, can live off of tires, whatever. You know, I was really expecting some like global pandemic to be released by that guy. Because
they did mention that. They mentioned
it. Yeah, but
they mentioned that they caught him in the process of attempting it. Yeah. And so that's to that. I think that's important because that's what I was about to bring up with respect to. It's not a techno-utopian novel because, and he sets the tone for that through the first like few chapters where he's filming junk DNA. That is saying that like you start by seeing all of the horrible ways that this stuff is being used that no one seems to be concerned about except for sensationalist media, you know, and I thought that, you know, he does call back to this stuff later, especially the reanimated, what's his name, Daniel Calvoni or something, the guy, the corpse that they bring back, you know, and he talks about he talks about that a lot, and I thought that I thought that it was really key because he's showing you how gruesome their society really is and how jaded they've become to it before he goes to this island where you see everyone using technology in a kind of in a different way, in a way that seems like almost too good to be true, you know.
I was going to say, go be daddy for a second.
Come here, Gooball. Come here.
Oh, and the other thing I wanted to bring up too was like the idea that the voluntary autists was something that I found fascinating, and I've been thinking for a long time, and this is a weird one, that, you know, I don't know if it's actually true or not that there's an uptick in autism cases, or there has been in the last 2 decades, and you know, there's a lot of anti-vax sentiment towards that, saying it causes it, but I almost think on some level it's evolution trying to fast track humanity and create, you know, get a, you know, another strain of human going that is more comfortable with abstract stuff. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. So, you know, to that, there's a scene in the paperback, is on page 209, where he's watching, after they canceled the Ned Landers section from the documentary, and he's watching it this news story being warped into some sort of aphorism, some sort of, you know, rhetorical theatrical production by the mystical realists, or the mystical Renaissance, where he's like, CNET editors must have mined the discarded segment of the documentary for some instant technical background when they put together their final release. I shouldn't have been surprised by any of this, but the spread with which events thousands of kilometers away had been recycled as an instant parable was unsettling enough. Hearing my own words echoed back at me as part of the feedback loop verged on the surreal. And so, like, this is again part of this, like, you don't know it until you read the book a second time, like you catch it on the second pass that this is like the eschaton of the feedback loop he's about to get himself into. Like you can feel it pulling on him as a story, and he's talking about basically hyperstition, like basically the thoughts become things, sort of, like all I have to do is like say it, and like technology has amplified the pace at which these things change, so that like this stuff is happening really fast. And Darren, to what you said about like, is autism part of this evolutionary process of us trying to adapt to an accelerating technological environment, and like what does that look like? I think that's a question related to these other questions about what it means to put godlike power into the hands of individuals. That comes up a lot in this book, and how that differs from putting the same godlike powers into the hands of anarcho-syndicalist collectives.
Well, and it's interesting because I think one of the things that he comes at autism like totally intersects with exactly where you're kind of leading this, which is like early on when he's going through the editing segment of working with the voluntary autists. I think, anyways, at some point they're like, "Hey, the lab assistant is like, hey, let's put you in there and let's see what your brain scan looks like." Oh no, it's the gal who's doing the neuro work, looking at autism, but and he's like really resistant to getting in there, and and then kind of like all throughout his relationships and his responses to the relationships, I feel like so much as an autist myself, I see echoes of am I autistic kind of being brought up in his personal narrative, and it's never directly addressed by Egan. And I think that autism is so much a symptom of a convergence of a variety of things. And one would be the rapid expansiveness of the experiences, like the diversification of the experiences of being human. And the vast increase in kind of the metacortex that can be held beyond our brains of things that we can get, ever deeper into, just it's been exponential. And then also how society, so much of modern society has been steadily narrowing. And so those things kind of the way that they intersect and converge, I think is so much of what leads to autism. And autism is, again, you could go on forever, but I feel like there's two different things which are going on, which is partially like the focus thing, but is also the oh boy, I'm going really fast.
Removing the ability for self-deception.
But the ability to connect with things, and I feel like so much of society narrowing leads to simply no places for if as you're going through your formation, you're not able to make connections in the world beyond your head. Then of course you're going to internalize. And I feel like that's a baseline thing with humanity, and anything interrelationally. But then you intersect that with this rapid expansion of within all of humanity and within science. Science has been kind of dissective for so long, and it lets us look deeper into things, but every time it does, it's cutting across all of the rest of the systems, as Ken Pirsig talks about in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And so just simply by us expanding so much, we're drawing like the totality of human collective consciousness very thin. And so we're experiencing fragmentation in between members. So autism is like in between members. And then society typifies what's normal and how we behave. And so then that kind of looks like everybody who's not able to be neurotypical within that range is then off kilter somehow, as opposed to it's just a artifact of like what's happening collectively with humanity. And so then you talk about, this God thing and this consciousness and this control. It's like we're just in the point of coming up against the limits of that. And now kind of coming down the other side where we're actually so much is reconverging. You have physicists and biologists getting together, like about a decade ago and being like, yeah, so from what we can tell, the basics of space-time in this area would give rise to biological life as we know it here. Like, it's just like, you know, we can follow it every step through. Like, it all, you know, one implies the other type of thing.
Oof.
Thank you for all that. One thread that I've been wanting to bring in, I think related to this, is kind of like where I don't know, where does Greg Egan, or where is this book pointing us in regards to this question of, can we connect to others? Is intimacy possible? And it sort of it seems like he's largely saying we think we're doing it, but it's sort of an evolutionary strategy to keep us to get in groups or in pair bonds. But actually we can let go of that illusion, but then there's a deeper connection, which is just the TOE. I mean, that's sort of the end of it, is we're not even going to consider ourselves humans anymore, because we know that all we have in common is the TOE. That's in the epilogue, one of the statements. So somehow we can therefore connect through that without, I guess, one impression I had was, you know, if we think we're modeling other people accurately, we're not. Like, if his definition of intimacy, I think, you know, you could come up with others, but it seems to be we've fooled ourselves into thinking we know someone else as well as we know ourselves. That's what he sort of first comes out with. So is that impossible? I mean, ultimately, of course, how could we? Because we're not even consistent entities ourselves, but certainly I can be better at predicting how my wife is going to react to certain things than I am at predicting how a stranger will react, because I have collected more like Bayesian knowledge of how she's going to respond. So it seems like a little bit of a, like, it doesn't need to be an absolute yes or no. Can we know someone perfectly? Of course, can we know ourselves? I mean, it opens up all kinds of questions.
Well, yeah, so that's an interesting point, in that there's a through line I didn't notice before reading through this book again, with Blind Sight by Peter Watts, which is where we started the entire book club for Future Fossils, in that both of the protagonists are arguably kind of like off, and also not trusted by people for whom they are appointed to act as interlocutors, or intermediaries. You know, Siri Keaton in Blind Sight is a science communicator that's supposed to be translating these, the discoveries made by transhuman researchers into, a language that can be understood by popular culture, and he's regarded as a spy by these scientists. And the same is true of Andrew Wirth. And to be honest, there's a certain amount of self-deception that he acknowledges throughout the book that he has fallen prey to, which I think in retrospect, like I've read certain interpretations of this book that suggest that he himself is autistic and just doesn't realize it. And that's part of why he didn't want to go into the brain scanner, is because he didn't want to deny, he didn't want that information about himself. He did not want, and we've been talking about this the whole call, that there's this thing of, people not wanting to be defined by their self-knowledge as well as by other people's knowledge of them, and so there is, it's an interesting a case where you realize there is a pattern through the book where he has only a Bayesian understanding of Gina, which is why she leaves him. He believes that the feelings that he develops for Akili cannot be requited in any way, because that would deny his model, that would defy his model of Vim Ver as someone who has made the choice of gender reassignment surgery to asex based on a particular set of ideological principles that are statistically associated with that decision, even though even at the very beginning of the book they say that people do it for all different kinds of reasons. Right. And so there is, in the can we be intimate, can we touch one another, and then the final statement of the book is yes, but only through the informational unity underlying everything. There is this it is akin to, again, the Hakim Bey. The book was Temporary Autonomous Zone, Poetic Terrorism, Ontological Anarchy, and other essays. And ultimately, he's making a kind of an anarchist statement about reality itself, in that, like, we have all of this, we have this immense room within which to move here, and that how to wrap this would basically that, again, that's just ultimately when he's looking around the class and he sees that these kids, like, could hardly even be categorized as human in the way that we used to struggle to define human and non-human. And I think that really,
Right.
that speaks to a final abolition of the kind of gender politics in which the first 99% of the book is embroiled. I talked about this a little bit in the talk I gave at Boom Festival about, like, identity politics makes sense until it doesn't. And that, like, it's like, I'm not, far be it from me to deny anyone their experience of reality in which it's important to assert these things, right? But at the toe level at which I would like to be thinking about this stuff, that it's all sort of ultimately obviated by a deeper unity to which those of us traumatized by colonialism should aspire.
Yeah, and I feel like colonialism, so much of the damage of it is its insistence on absolutism and on a limiting of definitions and definers. But, like, to circle back a little bit to that question, which I think is so much having to do with those limitations, is, I think, the question of can we connect is also overlapping in an unseen way with the question of will we. And can we connect is one question, and will we is, like, actually based on our need for predictability and our related fear of getting hurt. And so it's like, if we land on can we connect, it's so much related to the question of can we know, and then based on the degree to which we're self-defending or fearful or suspicious or naive or all sorts of things, we're going to land on where we feel at the moment of if we can connect or not. But I think that once we parse the question into more of those two aspects, we can come around to the idea that it's not unknowable, it's ever more knowable. Like anything, anyone, it's not that it can't be known. It's that there's always more to know. And if we can, and everything is choice and response. If we can orient ourselves more to the idea that ever more can be known, rather than just be like, oh, so sad and despairing that things can't be known in their entirety, then there's a way forward.
Right.
Which is ultimately an integral philosophy statement.
And with that, I'm going to say thank you so much to all of you and goodbye. I got to get off promptly right now and dash off to another thing. But thank you all so very much. And I'm stoked to keep talking with you about this in Discord and whatnot. So thank you.
Discord.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well, I've said everything I feel like I want to say. But if anyone wants to offer some thoughts before we close, I would love to make some space for that.
I had just made a note about this. I'm just reading, like, the bullet points that I wrote down, like, of all the kind of various genders. I just made some silly note about, is gender going quantum? Stuff like, we've moved on from binary. So as computers go quantum and things like that, gender is going that route. I think there's something like 60, maybe, I don't know how many, but there's at least like 64 terms relating to gender, which I thought was an interesting choice of numbers in terms of bits, like 2 to the 8th. Or no,
So
2 to the 6th.
Characters.
Yeah.
So he has this moment where he's headed out to the North Beach of the island, And he says, I caught my first glimpse of the open ocean, still hundreds of meters ahead. There were a dozen small boats moored in the harbor, one of the 6 armpits of the giant starfish. The view from the air came back to me fragile and exotic. What exactly was I standing on? An artificial island, an ocean-going machine, a bioengineered sea monster? The distinctions blurred into meaninglessness. And like they're at the intertidal zone between biology and technology, between solid ground and a social construct, an anarchist good faith agreement that this is, this unity is going to persist. I think is, ultimately what his statement is about gender, and that it's like it's right, like and about all of these things, about categories, that like categories are it's like money. It's like, is the dollar real? Well, yes, in a way it is real, in a way that we need to start thinking about reality in an information age.
One thing, kind of to that point with the genders thing and Achille, and I guess going back to the connection question is I found it interesting how, or just now thinking about it, how he can't. So it's like when the can we connect? Is it possible? And with the gender situation is that he is trying. He can't connect with Gina in a like heteronormative relationship that is what he's like supposed to be doing with his life, so to speak, right? Like with the intended structure. But then he does have actual connection with Achille, but not based on their genders or anything like that, but based on the shared experiences and their respect for each other. And that part of him, basically like that, the meaning of all these different categories starts to blur, but you can still find, if you embrace that, you can still find connection and meaning in spite of it, you rather than relying on the category to define the meaning of your relationship with someone, instead using the tangible experiences that you've had with that person as the meaning. I don't know if that makes sense. But.
And another piece in that interaction where they sort of make love or whatever it is that like pointing out, well, there's no orgasm really. It's not like we come to some culminating, there's no destination you're seeking in, if it's just touch and intimacy. It's actually this way open, sort of improvised interaction, and that feels like it maps to the shift that's being described in other ways. Like we're not going to reach some sort of metaphorical orgasm where you're proved to be a man because you did this, or you're proved to be the finality that orgasm kind of represents, especially for men, doesn't really fit when there's so much
right,
much thread and
it's not
play.
It's not using the intimacy as a means to get somewhere. It's like the intimacy
right.
is itself the thing to be experienced.
It's the process.
Yes.
Like things are going to, like it's almost like not a Zen thing or something. But it's the process.
Yes.
It's not the destination. It's all about the process. And that's kind of, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's in another Greg Egan novel, Child's Ladder. I think that's how you say it, Child's Ladder. It's a distant future fiction, and all of the human beings are genderless. But as they become intimate with someone, both partners will grow a set of unique genitals that line up with that person. And that it's like they're, he's looking at, deep into this kind of the future of this sort of philosophy about how you reconcile, a kind of like biological determinism with this radically emancipated, truly transhuman kind of identity construct platform, where it's like you still end up in these like lock and key relationships over which you don't actually have you don't have conscious control. You're still not choosing who you fall in love with, but it's it's yeah. So that he continues to try and like find different angles with which to treat this issue in other works, and I like that.
What was that?
Oh, Shield's Ladder.
Okay.
Yeah. But of course, at the same time, like that notion that your body does not like open itself sexually to someone unless you're in love with them is like one of the more dangerous tightrope walking, you know, misogynistic bullshit things that religious traditionalists have to say about like, oh, you can't get pregnant from rape and like that kind of thing, you know. So it's like yeah.
Just because they grow genitals that match yours doesn't mean it's love.
It's like, but your body says yes. Like, yeah, let's not.
Your 4-dimensional vagina looks like it matches my hyper penis. You know?
Right.
He's got an amazing imagination.
That just the just the world building in this book just blew me away. I just loved a lot of the, like, I feel like it's one thing to, you know, to do sci-fi world building about, you know, spaceships and things that are these big events, but it's another thing to take a sci-fi standpoint, or like, you know, looking into the future and then being like, what would the mundane average person, you know, how would they interact with this new technology? I mean, you guys already touched a lot on that, on stuff while I was driving, like the farm that you know, regulates his melatonin just so he can sleep and things like that. You know, all of those things really just blew me away from like a world building standpoint. I loved it. I loved the spooky military robot, which was funny because it wasn't like the focus of the book about these spooky military robots. It was like, that's also just a thing that exists. That's not really what we're here for. But like, that's absolutely terrifying. And like, it seems like so they must have already litigated all the ethics behind autonomous, invisible blade monsters, you know, decades prior to when this story takes place, and kind of come up not on it, I guess. And like, it's like, there's lots of things the story's not about that I would love to know more about, and I think that makes it really cool.
Yeah, like something, it's a throwaway thing that we didn't bring up in this conversation. We kind of skirted around, was the fact that he can deep fake all sorts of shit for like legitimate news stories. You know, that there's an understanding that, like, much as like the like jump cuts and match cuts in film were not something that people innately understood and like became a part of the cinematic lexicon over years. This notion that you're gonna just like computer fabricate something, but it's still part of an actual news story, and it's just part of the sort of like fudging that comes with journalism and storytelling,
like photoshopping.
You're just it's like, okay, we all
a little bit,
right? Like we all know it's like real enough to count, and like that epistemic shift, and to tell a story where it's like, I don't know that. I've been thinking about, like, I don't know whether or not he actually fully digested that shift in a believable way with his characters. Like, because you would, for the society to have to go through that kind of a reckoning, might lead to a different result with respect to the way that these different fringe cosmological groups end up enacting themselves politically. Like, they may not care, you know, like they may believe that reality is far more performative and unsettled and subject to, you know, power conflict on a different level than the idea that you would ultimately have, you know, a single anthro-cosmological keystone that would then set things in cement for everyone else. You know, like it wasn't clear to me whether like the challenge to a consensus epistemology that deepfakes present was like had actually been integrated. But then again, he does give a lot of airtime to how deeply people are willing to bullshit themselves in this future and like not think about the deep issues.
I guess one of the things that like we're seeing right now that I guess either would have already happened and then been reconciled by the time that takes place, or something that he wasn't quite seeing with, because that's the thing is right. We've had all sorts of issues with fake news stories and yellow journalism type stuff without deepfakes even really being easily accessible to most people yet. Right. And with the internet and everything, we are already, this whole pandemic has put a fine point on it, reaching this point where we have people living in whole separate realities from each other in terms of what they believe and everything. I mean, everyone's talked about that to death, but it's just interesting that does seem to be kind of absent from this narrative in that, like, yeah, people are fudging up the stories and making a bunch of stuff up, but it's almost more like the news corporations or whatever are going to just make a narrative and then everyone's just going to say, all right, I guess that's what it is then, even though everyone kind of knows that it's BS, but there's less of like full on like disagreement about what's happening. I don't know. I'm also
it's not clear how the politics is working in the world he paints. There's no big difference other than stateless. I mean, the corporations are kind of running the show, clearly, but there seem to still be nations that have different perspectives and are cooperating or not in different ways.
The gun law refugees that like all of the
that was good.
All the American Second Amendment patriot types end up leaving the United States and becoming international waters pirates or whatever. Like and that's a very believable subset of the seasteading futures, is that all of these libertarian enclaves just end up becoming the new buccaneers, which again speaks to the tension in like a radical individualism and a sort of power domination control dystopia.
Yeah.
Well, folks, I got to scoot, but if anything hasn't been discussed in this conversation, and I'm sure I'm going to find plenty of things to discuss when I go back and look at all the dog-eared pages I didn't look at yet. We'll pick it up in Discord, and I thank you all for being here.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for holding us all together.
I learned so much just by listening to you guys talk. That was cool. So.
Thanks. And I didn't hold us all together. It was a distributed information architecture.
Indeed. You're the founder of the web. Thank you.
Oh God, if I am, I'm the Violet
Nice meeting all, dude.
Node 0.
Yeah.